Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 20. August to November 1916. 1st of August, 1916. Dear Lady Grantham, it is very kind of you to think of me, and I'm sorry to have caused you worry. My wound was not a terribly serious one. That is, a lengthy convalescence is expected, but I am in no danger. At present I am still in France, but I expect to be sent to England within the next few days. Sincerely, Corporal T. Barrow, R.A.M.C. 1st of August, 1916. Dear Miss Hughes, I'm sorry to have worried everyone about my wound. It's only in my shoulder. It wasn't a very dangerous one to begin with, and at this point the only thing to worry about is how much use I'll have of the arm, once it's all said and done. Lady Sybil is entirely correct about my being moved several times, in addition to it taking a while for your letters to catch up to me. When you've got a wound that isn't very serious, they take their time shuffling you about from pillar to post and give you a lot of morphine to keep you quiet while they're doing it. So everything was a bit hazy for a while, and between one thing and another I didn't realize that you would be waiting for news. I'm still in France at the moment, but they expect me to get on a ship to England within the next day or two. Space permitting, I will then be at an orthopedic hospital in London. That's bone and joint specialists. I'm not sure how long they will keep me there, but I am hoping for home service after that. Unless, of course, we win the war while I'm still recuperating. I was wounded in the big offensive that's been in the papers, on the very first morning of it, in fact. My section was posted at the front to collect wounded. I brought 2 in, and then was shot on the way to the 3rd one. We were well behind the advance, so I can only guess that a stray bullet found its way through a gap in the line. Considering what a terrible morning it was, I was lucky. My mates brought me in right away and made sure I was well looked after. There were so many wounded that some had to wait days before they got any sort of care at all, in which time even a minor wound can develop complications. It will take me some time to reply to everyone's letters, so perhaps you could share this one with the others. Thomas. P.S. In England now, I ended up where they expected. The Royal Orthopedic Hospital, Shepherd's Bush. 1st of August, 1916. Dear Anna, best wishes on your engagement. If you're sure it's what you want. And congratulations to Mr. Bates. A cottage on the estate sounds nice, and it certainly is very practical of Mr. Bates to have considered your career before proposing. I wrote the details of my wound, etc. to Mrs. Hughes, so I won't repeat it all except to say that I am on my way back to England and in no danger. Might be crippled for life, but I expect there's thousands of men who would take that in a heartbeat if they could be on their way to England and in no danger. I had it pretty good where I was, and would just as soon have stayed, but we can't always get what we want in life, can we? I'll write again once I've got settled in the new hospital in England. Thomas. After reading her letter from Thomas, Anna immediately went to Mrs. Hughes' sitting room to find out what her one had said. Miss Hughes handed Anna hers to read, but Anna was unable to return the favor. She and John couldn't announce their engagement until everything was fully settled with the first Miss Bates. Instead, she said, after scanning the first paragraph of Miss Hughes's letter, "Not sure how much use he'll have of it. In mine, he said he might be crippled for life. Do you suppose he's being dramatic?" "Seeing as it's Thomas, it could go either way," Miss Hughes said. "He says they're sending him to a specialist. Perhaps they don't know yet how well it'll heal." That did seem likely now she mentioned it. "At least now we know he isn't dying," she said. "Though he could have said so a bit sooner." Honestly, if it turned out that it had been barely a scratch and he'd left them waiting a month for news, he'd wish it had been more serious. "I expect things were a bit difficult," Miss Hughes pointed out, "even with a wound that wasn't dangerous." The Royal Orthopedic Hospital was, in Thomas's estimation, possibly the dullest place in the world. For the first weeks he was there, his only regular obligation was to report each morning for gymnastic exercises, a half-hour program of exceedingly mild calisthenics. These were supposedly therapeutic in nature, but since his left arm was still immobilized and there wasn't anything wrong with the rest of him, there didn't seem to be much point, except perhaps to remind them that they were still in the army and could be made to do pointless things. The rest of the day was largely his own, although permission had to be obtained from a ward sister to leave the hospital grounds. Mostly he tried to help out with ward chores, but the nursing sisters hoarded all properly medical work for themselves, and as he was far from being the only convalescent itching for something to do, competition for the unskilled work was fierce. Matters improved a bit once one of the physiotherapists, as tired of nagging him about keeping his arm in a sling as he was of being nagged about it, instead strapped his upper arm to his side. He probably wasn't meant to like it, but the advantage over the sling was that it left the lower part of his arm free, allowing him the use of his hand while preventing him from accidentally moving his shoulder. Just being able to hold a cigarette in that hand and a teacup in the other was a pleasure, and he quickly progressed from there. He'd been unable to avoid being issued a set of hospital blues, though he did manage to keep hold of his proper uniform by hiding it in his rucksack, and once he'd got the hang of moving his left arm only from the elbow down, the first thing he did was tailor them into some approximation of a decent fit. As hospital blues were designed to fit everyone equally badly, once word got round, he had as much tailoring work as he could handle and took payment in cash, food from home, or, in the neediest cases, juicy gossip. While his arm was immobilized, his physical therapy consisted mainly of having warm compresses and occasionally galvanic current applied to his shoulder. He wasn't sure what any of that was meant to do, but it wasn't particularly unpleasant, and they didn't call him in for it above once a week. The physiotherapists gave most of their attention to the amputees, so he wasn't too concerned about it. Once he was cleared for movement therapy, his sessions were no more frequent, but less pleasant. He still started off with the warm compresses, but after that the therapists would instruct him to move his arm as far as he could in various directions, then pull or push it just a little bit further. Sometimes they attached it to a positively medieval-looking contraption for measuring the range of motion, and when he pointed out that he didn't seem to be making much progress, showed him that he was now, for example, able to raise his arm by 8 degrees of a circle instead of 5. Improvement in some directions was better than others. Thomas learned that the joint the doctor back in France had referred to, the acromioclavicular, was the one which connected the collarbone to the shoulder blade. It mainly came into use when raising the arm out to the side, and so that was the movement that gave him the most trouble. There was also something about his shoulder blade not moving as freely as it should have done, but that, they said, was largely a matter of muscle damage, and could be expected to continue to improve if he worked at it. The other piece of the problem was nerve damage, which one of the physiotherapists discovered more or less by accident during a galvanic current treatment. Just below the entry wound on the back of his shoulder was a numb patch about the size of a pack of cigarettes. Thomas had noticed that the entry wound hurt a lot less than the exit wound did, but had supposed that was because it was smaller, or perhaps because he couldn't see it. Apparently some of the nerves supplying that area had been damaged, either by the bullet or by Captain Allenby's efforts to stop his bleeding. The numbness didn't bother him much. After all, he hadn't noticed it. But the nerve damage also meant that there was a section of his shoulder muscle that, while it hadn't been touched by the bullet, didn't do anything. It turned out to be the bit that was responsible for reaching forward. There wasn't much to be done about that either, except to keep exercising the other muscles involved, and hope they managed to compensate. None of it was too bad, really, and Thomas knew he had nothing to complain about compared to the men who had lost limbs. But he wasn't going to be lifting a stretcher with it, or even a dinner tray for that matter. He periodically sent guarded reports on the subject to Anna and Miss Hughes. To his surprise, neither of them asked the obvious question about what precisely he was going to do for a living once he was kicked out of the army. In his darker moments, he almost wished Anna would ask, so that he could reply that he'd heard of valeting was a good job for a cripple. But she didn't, so Thomas didn't say it, and mostly tried not to think about the problem. That worked up until the day about 3 months after he'd come to the hospital. He was called in to meet with the discharge planning officer, a white-haired gentleman in spectacles. "Corporal Barrow," he said. "Yes, sir. According to your medical reports, you've made most of the progress you're likely to make." Thomas nodded. One of the physiotherapists had said as much at his last session, so while the news wasn't welcome, it wasn't exactly a surprise. "Are you still hoping for home service?"
Yes, sir. That is, assuming there's no chance of active duty. I should say not. Wouldn't you like a medical discharge? No, I bloody well would not. Not particularly, sir. All right, he said and wrote something down. Then let's schedule you for a medical board review in, let's say, another 2 months. If you do manage to make a bit more improvement by then, there may be some chance of home service.
He supposed that was the best he was likely to get. He'd work harder at his exercises, and in any case, it would give him more time before he had to figure anything out.
Thank you, sir. And in the meantime, you can go on home leave. The officer continued.
Fuck!
Sir?
You can continue with your therapy exercises at home, he explained. The physios report that you're quite diligent, so I'm sure you'll have no trouble, and you'll be home for Christmas. Won't that be nice?
Yes, sir, but
I haven't got a home, is the thing. But? No, he couldn't possibly say that. And even if he did, it was hardly the discharge planning officer's problem. He'd been earning a bit while he was here, though that would stop once he was on leave. So it wasn't as though he'd go from here to begging on the streets.
But I'm not sure precisely where I ought to go,
he said. That much was completely true.
Me mum and dad aren't living, see. I'll have to run a few people to sort out what's best.
Of course. Why don't we schedule your leave to begin next week? That will give you some time to make arrangements.
Thank you, sir.
Once he was dismissed, Thomas went out into the courtyard and smoked an anxious cigarette. Who could he write to? Once, the answer would have been obvious. Theo. But Theo was dead and couldn't help anyone. Rollins and the wardmaster would, he thought, help if they could. But he already knew they couldn't. That left... No, he couldn't possibly write to Alice and ask if he could stay there for a couple of months. For one thing, he'd scarcely heard from her since he left for France. A letter or two and a Christmas card. That was it. And even if she'd let him, he didn't think he could stand it. He couldn't possibly avoid seeing Dad and the shop and all the rest of it. Besides, her house couldn't possibly be more than 2 up and 2 down. They'd be crawling up each other's arses, and no mistake. There was one place he knew that had plenty of room. They wouldn't, though. Would they? No, he couldn't even ask. He'd be making himself ridiculous. On the other hand, every time Anna or Mrs. Hughes wrote, they asked if there was anything he needed. They meant cigarettes, or tea, or socks, not a roof over his head. Even if they wanted to help, Carson would never allow it. What if they could maneuver around him? Anna could ask one of the young ladies. No, they couldn't grant permission for something like that. Anna could talk to Bates, and Bates to his lordship. But considering that the last thing of any note that he'd done in the house was tell his lordship he was an idiot, he'd be pushing his luck even asking for a decent reference from that quarter. But after thinking about it for the rest of the day and well into a sleepless night, he couldn't come up with any better ideas. Sneaking into the day room, where he wasn't supposed to be, given it was the middle of the night, he tucked himself into a corner with a shaded lamp and wrote, 2nd of November, 1916. Dear Anna, glad to hear you're well. I'm not surprised that the soon-to-be former Miss B is dragging her heels. I expect she wants to take him for all he's worth now he's a man of property. Funny you should ask if there's anything you could do to help, because I've got a bit of a problem myself. I've finished my treatment here, but they want me to convalesce a bit more before reviewing my case for home service, so they're giving me 2 months home leave. That, he thought, would establish that while the favor he was asking for was substantial, it wasn't to be of indefinite duration. As you know, I haven't got a home, so that's a bit difficult. The army doesn't pay you when you're on leave, so if I'm not careful, I'll run through all my savings. He'd run through them even if he was careful, but most people were more inclined to help you if you weren't desperate. You and Miss Hughes have both mentioned that Mr. Carson is having a difficult time with only 1 footman, especially knowing William could be called up at any time. While I can't claim to be completely fit, I have been helping out here at the hospital, and I can manage quite a bit. That might be enough to get the point across, but he didn't have a lot of time to make his arrangements. A delay asking for clarification could be costly. He continued, So what I'm wondering is if it might be possible for me to come there for my leave, if I made myself useful. Perhaps at the village hospital as well, if Mr. Carson doesn't have enough for me to do. I wouldn't expect paying, of course, since I won't be able to do all my old duties.
What do you think? It was just an idea I had, but perhaps you could broach the subject with Miss Hughes, and if she doesn't think it's completely out of the question, and she could talk to Mr. Carson, etc. But if you don't feel it's a good idea, forget about it, and I'll think of something else. Letters should still reach me here at the hospital through the beginning of next week. Thomas. Writing that letter was quite possibly the most humiliating experience of Thomas's life, but reading it over, it didn't seem too bad. Apart from the brazen audacity of the request, he thought he'd managed to strike a casual enough tone, as though this were simply a passing notion instead of the only even vaguely feasible idea that he'd been able to come up with. Still, it took all the willpower he had to put it in an envelope, affix a stamp, and put it in the mailbag instead of lighting it on fire. Miss Hughes glanced up from the letter that Anna had just handed to her.
What's this about the soon-to-be farmer, Miss B? She'd forgotten about that part.
Mrs. Bates, Anna explained. Mr. Bates is hoping she'll consent to a divorce. It's the next paragraph.
Home leave? Well, that's nice. Oh dear.
Yes, said Anna. You can see why I brought it to you. She couldn't imagine refusing to help, but nor could she imagine asking Lord and Lady Grantham to take in a footman on leave from the army.
I do, she said. Of course, we must find a way for him to come here. This is the only home he has. But it's not precisely a regular sort of arrangement, and you know how Mr. Carson feels about irregularity.
Anna nodded. I expect that's why Thomas didn't write to him to begin with. That and the fact that Mr. Carson didn't like Thomas very much. Miss Hughes considered.
Perhaps it would be best if Mr. Bates spoke to his lordship, she suggested. Broach the subject, as Thomas says. Lord knows he talks enough about how he'd like to contribute more to the war.
I don't think this is precisely the sort of contribution he has in mind, Anna said dryly.
Perhaps not, but Thomas has been wounded in the service of king and country, so it is a contribution.
He had a point. I'll speak to Mr. Bates and see what he thinks, she said. Mr. Bates, as it turned out, received the suggestion with great skepticism.
Really?
He asked when she had finished explaining what Thomas and she and Miss Hughes wanted. He doesn't have anywhere else to go.
You have to admit it takes a bit of nerve considering the way he carried on about my limp when I first came here. At least I was taking a job that was available. I didn't ask his lordship to invent one for me.
He doesn't want a job exactly, she pointed out, and it's only temporary.
Temporary until he gets his feet under the table again,
Mr. Bates said. She gave him a steady look, and he sighed.
I won't stand in the way, but do I have to be the one to suggest it?
You can casually bring it up to his lordship, Anna explained. Get an idea of how he feels about it. Say that Thomas has got home leave, remind his lordship that he hasn't any family, and so on. If Miss Hughes or I asked, we'd have to start by saying we wanted a favour. Mr. Bates scoffed and shook his head, but said,
Fine, but only because you're the one asking. We've had a letter from Thomas,
Bates remarked as he put Robert's evening coat in the wardrobe.
Oh, how was he getting on?
Robert remembered that he'd been wounded a few months back in that terrible business on the Somme, and that he was now recovering in a hospital in London.
Well enough. He says he's completed his treatment, and he's hoping for home service.
That's good.
It was plain enough that Bates was working his way up to asking for something. He only hoped it wasn't to stop him being sent back to France.
I should think he'd have a good chance, seeing as he's been at the front for a while and been wounded.
Yes, my lord. They've given him 2 months' home leave to continue recuperating before his medical panel.
Oh.
That put a different complexion on things. More like they wanted him to convalesce at his own expense before invaliding him out.
Just how badly injured is he?
He's been a bit cagey about that,
Bates admitted.
We're fairly certain he still has both arms.
That was good. Robert had no idea what they'd do with a one-armed footman.
I suppose he's luckier than some, and if the army can't find a use for him, perhaps he'll be back before William's called up. Carson ought to like that.
Carson had never precisely approved of Thomas, but with a shortage of manpower, perhaps he'd come to appreciate him.
Yes, my lord.
Bates hesitated. Now they were getting to whatever the request was, Robert supposed.
What is it?
I don't know if you remember, but he has no family to speak of, and we're not using his old room for anything since we've not taken on any new male staff. Anna and Miss Hughes have been discussing whether it might be suitable for him to come here while he's on leave."
And there it was. Honestly, Robert had expected worse.
"What does Carson say to this plan?"
If Carson had forbidden it, Robert really didn't think he ought to override him. Not again.
"I don't believe they've spoken to him about it yet. I'm sure the first thing he'd want to know is whether you and her ladyship would find it an imposition."
Robert sighed inwardly. In other words, they hoped to be able to tell Carson that he'd already given his approval. Bates did seem to enjoy putting him in an awkward position regarding Carson and Thomas.
"If Carson and Miss Hughes both think it a good idea, I won't object," he said carefully. "I don't suppose they'd release him from the hospital if he still required any sort of special looking after."
"I don't think so,"
Bates said.
"He spoke of making himself useful downstairs."
"Good,"
"I do think with some obligation in the circumstances,"
Robert said, and it wouldn't hurt to get some idea of his capacities before he came looking for his job back.
"But if Carson or Miss Hughes feels it's a disruption, we'll think of something else. Perhaps one of the tenants could take on a paying guest."
Several households in the village billeted the men who worked at the hospital, which Robert understood was a useful supplement to income while their men were away. They could help pay for it if necessary. It wouldn't be much, and if the estate manager could point out a household that was struggling, both parties could benefit from the same expenditure.
"Very good, my lord." "This is not a hostel for down-on-the-luck ex-servicemen,"
Mr. Carson said.
"No one's saying it is,"
Miss Hughes responded. They'd certainly been right to approach his lordship first.
"He's lived here for years. Where else would he go?"
"He's worked here for years,"
Mr. Carson corrected. Miss Hughes ignored him.
"His lordship has said that if we find it inconvenient, he'll find him lodging in the village. Do you really think it best to put him to that trouble, not to mention expense, when we have rooms stamped and empty on the men's corridor?"
"I think that Thomas should never have asked in the first place,"
Mr. Carson said.
"Nor should Miss Bates have troubled his lordship with it."
He sighed.
"But now that he has, I suppose we've little choice."
As the train neared Downton Village, Thomas looked again at the letter he'd had from Miss Hughes. 4th of November, 1916. Dear Thomas, yes, of course you should come here. We've not taken on any male staff since the war began, so your room is just as you left it, and I'll have your things brought down from the attics. Let us know what train to expect you on. We're all looking forward to seeing for ourselves that you're safe and sound, and to hearing about your time in France. Sincerely, Elsie Hughes. He couldn't quite believe that it had all been that easy. Part of him wondered if it might not be some sort of cruel joke. Not that Miss Hughes was likely to do such a thing, but he wouldn't put it past O'Brien. Anna had written that she'd lately been amusing herself at the expense of the newest housemaid. She'd probably find it very funny to have him turn up at the back door and everyone wondering what he thought he was doing. But Thomas knew both Mrs. Hughes' writing and O'Brien's, and this was definitely the former. Tucking the letter back into his pocket, he looked out the window at the familiar approach to the Downton station. It looked just as it always had, which, should it be a surprise? It had only been a year and a half. But it was, just the same. When the train puffed to a stop, he put his rucksack over his good shoulder and hopped off, looking about to see if everything was as he remembered it. The station hadn't gotten any closer to the house, unfortunately, and he was contemplating a quick stop at the pub. It wasn't a warm day for October and a long walk, when the horn of a nearby motor car sounded, making him jump. He looked to see who was making all the racket, and saw that it was, of all people, Lady Edith. And now she was leaning out the driver's side window and waving. Thomas looked behind him to see who she could possibly be waving to, and, seeing no one, cautiously approached. "My lady," he said with a nod. He had said that he'd be making himself useful. Perhaps he could begin by rounding up whoever it was she had come to the station to meet. As long as he wasn't expected to help with the guest's luggage, he had his good hand full with his own. "Corporal Barrow," she said, returning the nod. "You look very smart." Thank God he was back in his proper uniform and not hospital blues. "That's kind of you to say."
"I hope the journey wasn't difficult."
"Not at all." He wished she'd say what she wanted.
There was another motor car behind hers, and the driver looked to be getting tired of waiting for her to move out of the way. She noticed it too and leaned out the window to make a placating gesture.
"You'd better hop in, quick," she said.
"My lady?"
"I'm not sure there's room for him to get around."
Oh, apparently he was hitching a ride with Lady Edith and the mystery guest. Not one to look a gift horse in the mouth, he quickly circled round the car and got into the front passenger seat. With a crash of gears, Lady Edith set the car in motion.
"I'm not quite an expert yet."
"My lady?"
"I'm driving,"
she explained, turning on to the lane that led from the station to the house. Weren't they picking up anyone else? She continued.
"I haven't had as much practice as I'd like, because everyone asks Branson first if they want to go anywhere, and I can't waste petrol just driving around for no reason."
"How vexing,"
he said. They were definitely heading towards the house. Perhaps she'd had some other errand in the village, or had decided to come and fetch him from the station simply as an excuse to drive the car.
"Of course, there are worse problems to have,"
Lady Edith said quickly, looking embarrassed. Thomas remembered how, at the orthopedic hospital, it was nearly impossible to complain about anything in front of the amputees without feeling slightly ashamed of yourself, especially the ones who had lost 2 or more limbs. In a house where no one else had been shot at all, except for Bates, he supposed his relatively minor wound could have the same effect on people.
"I expect there will be more driving for you to do if Bronson is called up,"
he said.
"Yes," Lady Edith said. "That's what I learned. I wanted to do something useful, even if it was only filling in for a man here at home. But I suppose even if my driving were useful, it would be a very small contribution compared to everything that's happening in France."
It was, but Thomas could hardly say that.
"It does give the men some comfort to know that things back home are continuing much as they always have."
That was true, though not precisely to the point of what Lady Edith had said.
"You see the French villages that have been destroyed, and imagine what it would be like if it were all happening here."
Thomas did not, in fact, imagine that. Not often, anyway. But he remembered Lieutenant Crawley talking about it. They rounded a curve. Lady Edith braked with a bit of a jolt, and Downton came into view ahead of them.
"I can't even imagine."
No, Thomas was sure she couldn't. When they reached the house, Lady Edith drove around to the side and pulled the car up to the garage, where Branson came out to collect it and put it away, like a groom taking her horse after she'd been for a ride. Thomas thanked her for the lift and stood awkwardly, his rucksack at his feet, until she'd walked out of sight around the front of the house. Branson, leaning on the open driver's side door, said, "Did you ever think you'd see this place again?" Thomas looked up at the house and then admitted, "No." Chuckling, Branson slid into the driver's seat and Thomas gathered up his rucksack and started for the house. The kitchen courtyard looked strangely empty to Thomas, even though he couldn't see that anything was missing. After a moment he realized it was that anywhere he'd been for the last year and a half, a place like that would have had at least half a dozen men in it, patients put outside for some fresh air, or orderlies caging a smoke. Inside, he knew, they'd be getting the upstairs tea ready to take up. Daisy and Miss Patmore might be putting the finishing touches on cakes or finger sandwiches, and Carson would be setting a silver teapot onto a tray. Perhaps Thomas would polish it later. There were some wooden crates near the back door, and Thomas sat down on one, lighting a cigarette. He'd best put himself into a frame of mind to be grateful he was here, he knew. Not that he was ungrateful, exactly. Being here was certainly the best of the options available to him. But the thought of stepping through that door felt like... Not like going into the grave. He would not be that histrionic about it. Like going to his old primary school, perhaps, and cramming himself into a child's desk. And worse, being the only one to see the absurdity of it. He'd shed Thomas, everyone's least favorite footman, like a snakeskin, and become Corporal Barrow, the magnificent bastard, who was good at field triage and kept his head in no man's land. And now he was here again. He'd probably smoked hundreds of cigarettes in this courtyard. Thousands. And he was sitting, he realized, to one side of the crate because he'd left room for Rollins to come and crowd in beside him, like he always did when Thomas sneaked off on his own to brood. Instead, the door banged open, and it was Daisy, with a bowl of scraps to toss into the bin.
"He's out here!" she called over her shoulder.
"What are you doing out here? Everyone's waiting for you to turn up!"
Thomas lifted the cigarette in explanation. "Thomas!" Anna appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing out here?" "Smoking," he said. "Well, finish it and come inside." The cigarette was nearly finished, so Thomas took a last drag, flicked it away, and went inside. Daisy had been exaggerating slightly when she said that everyone was waiting for him, but quite a few of them were assembled in the servants' hall. Bates, William, Miss O'Brien, and a couple of maids he didn't know. Miss Hughes came in a moment later from her sitting room and said, "Well, aren't you looking well?" "Thank you," Thomas said, looking around at all of them. What were they expecting exactly? A show? Miss O'Brien glanced up from her sewing. "You do look well," she said in quite a different tone than Miss Hughes had. "What about this wound we've heard so much about, then?" "It's in my shoulder," Thomas pointed out. "Would you like me to strip off right here so that you can have a look at it?" Naturally, that was the moment Carson chose to turn up. "I beg your pardon." "Sorry, Mr. Carson," Thomas said. If he'd been laying bets on how far he'd get into his return to Downton before he had to say that again, he'd have expected at least 5 minutes. Clearly, he'd been too optimistic. Carson gave him one of his usual looks of contempt. Thomas hadn't missed those one bit, before turning to William and saying, "You can go up for the tea tray in a quarter of an hour, fully clothed, if you don't mind." Once he'd gone, Thomas remarked, "Now I feel I'm really back," to no one in particular. He'd sort of expected a too right or a typical, but instead there was a clanging silence, which Miss Hughes finally broke by saying, "We'll be having our tea in about an hour if you'd like to take your things upstairs." "I would, thanks," he said, and escaped. His old room was indeed just as he'd left it. They hadn't even taken the label with his name off the door. The sight was simultaneously comforting and nauseating. Had they kept a place for him all this time? Had they thought all along he'd come crawling back? Had they feared that taking down his name would tempt the fates to snuff out his life? Had they simply never given a thought to the room or its occupant? He shook off the questions and went inside. They had, as Miss Hughes had said, brought down his trunk. It was sitting rather awkwardly in the middle of the floor. He'd have to remember to drag it into a more convenient spot before everyone went to sleep. He was bound to make quite a racket. Leaving his rucksack on top of the trunk, he crossed to the window and opened it. The room had a stuffy, unaired feel, and then made up the bed. Someone had left a stack of bedding on the mattress. Nice of them. And he was certainly experienced enough at the task to make quick work of it. Unpacking his rucksack, shaving things, a few change of shirts and underclothes, he considered where to stash the biscuit tin that held his letters before realizing that since nearly all of them were from people in this house, there wasn't any particular need to hide them. Even if anyone, Miss O'Brien for instance, did decide to rummage through them, the worst she'd find was one or two from Nurse Fortescue, whose given name turned out to be Harriet, inquiring whether they might see each other after the war. Thomas, in his replies, feigned ignorance as to the significance of the question, saying only that he didn't know where he'd be after the war and she'd soon given up. Those simple chores took little enough time that he could have begun unpacking his trunk as well, but he knew what was in there under all his civilian clothes. The locked box containing his letters from Peter. The key to it was on his watch chain. Well, as he was still in the army, he ought only to be wearing his uniform anyway. His armchair, a battered one he'd swiped from the attic as a treat to himself for becoming first footman, was still by the window, so he sat in it and put his feet up on the sill. It really was like he never left. Thomas did look well, Anna thought as he came down to tea. Well, but different. It wasn't just the uniform or the stiff way he carried his left arm, about which she was as curious as Miss O'Brien, although now that the older woman had put her foot in it, Anna was going to have to be even more cautious about asking. Lady Mary had spoken a few times about a change in Mr. Matthew. "As though he knows things he can never tell me," she said once, and perhaps that was the change Anna saw in Thomas as well. "Look at all this," he observed, slipping into his old place beside her as Daisy and Miss Patmore brought in platters of food. "Is this some kind of an occasion?" Daisy said, "It's not every day you come home from a war, is it?" She put a plate of minced chicken sandwiches directly in front of Thomas's place. Thomas glanced at her sharply. I suppose not.
What did they give you for your tea in the army, then?
Asked Ethel, inspecting her fingernails. Bread and jam, Thomas said. Or bread and cheese.
Is that all?
Miss Patmore asked, putting some rock cakes next to the sandwiches. Usually, Thomas answered. We have dinner earlier, though.
Well, I suppose you don't have to wait around serving while that lot linger over their coffee and cigars,
Ethel said, jerking her chin in the direction of the ceiling.
Ethel!
Miss Hughes said sharply. Next to her, Thomas huffed. We give the patients their dinner first, he explained. But it's a good deal less elaborate.
You don't say,
Ethel said in what was probably supposed to be a sultry tone. It occurred to Anna that between one thing and another, it was likely no one had told her about Thomas. It was about then that Mr. Carson came in and they all stood up, Thomas a beat behind the rest of them. The next few moments they were all occupied with passing platters and filling their plates. Anna kept an eye on Thomas and noticed that he scarcely used his left hand. When Miss Hughes passed him something from the left, he would reach across himself to take it with his right hand. But then when they started eating, he held his fork in his left and didn't seem to have much trouble with it.
How was the train?
Miss Hughes asked Thomas. Fine, he said cautiously, as though he thought the question might be some sort of trap. I expect it's a bit of an adjustment, Mr. Bates said, being back in England. A bit, he said, still sounding wary. I found myself missing the strangest things when I got back from South Africa. The way army tents smell in the rain, these birds that used to make such a racket in the mornings. Thomas rotated his teacup in his hand. So far, I mostly miss the people. Of course, said Mr. Bates. That too, even the ones you didn't like very much. I don't know about that, Thomas said, and then seemed to be waiting for a reaction that didn't come. After a moment, Ethel said,
What'll you do with your leave, then?
She tilted her head to look at him through her eyelashes. Anna was definitely going to have to tell her the facts. Thomas took a sip of his tea. I hadn't really thought about it. Whatever needs doing, I suppose.
Mr. Carson cleared his throat, and Miss Hughes said quickly, Of course we don't expect you to work while you're on leave. You're meant to be convalescing.
Thomas looked a bit surprised at that, which in turn surprised Anna. He'd written in his letter of making himself useful, but he'd never exactly gone out of his way to look for things to do while he was actually working at Downton. Cautiously, Thomas said, At this point, it's the best thing for me to use the shoulder as much as I can. But if you don't have anything for me to do, I'll see what I can do down at the village hospital. There's bound to be plenty of work there. That may be best, said Mr. Carson, as it is the army which employs you at the moment. After they'd finished their tea, Thomas went out into the courtyard for a cigarette, and Anna joined him there.
It's so good to have you back, she said, and looking so well. We were all worried.
Lighting a cigarette, he said, I wasn't really in any danger after the first night. That might be true, but it wasn't as though they had known that. He went on, Infection, of course, but like I said in my letter, my mates look after me. Made sure I got the dressing changed regularly and everything.
He'd mentioned his mates a few times, she noticed. Is there anyone in particular that you miss?
He gave her a sharp look and flicked ash from his cigarette. Not like that, no. He seemed about to say something, then took a puff from his cigarette instead. Looking out over the courtyard wall, he said, They all liked me there was the thing. Oh, Anna would have liked to say that they all liked him here too, but it wouldn't be entirely true, and Thomas knew it. Certainly no one wished him ill, with the possible exception of Miss O'Brien, but several would have been just as pleased if he'd been doing well somewhere else. Mr. Carson chief among them. Thomas must have been thinking along similar lines. He continued, I suppose Carson would just about piss on me if I were on fire, pardon my language, but that first night after I was shot, the ward master and captain, one of the medical officers, gave me a blood transfusion, on the sly like. We weren't doing them that night because we were so busy. It ties up the donor for about an hour, and we couldn't spare the men for it. But they did it, 'cause it was me. Anna wasn't entirely certain what a blood transfusion meant, but it sounded serious.
Were you...
Searching for a word, she settled on the euphemism he had used.
in danger, then?
Well, they don't give them out for nothing. Thomas said. I don't remember a lot from that night, but I must have been losing quite a bit of blood.
That was likely as close as he'd come to saying that he could have died. She wondered if they would have gotten a telegram or just never heard from him again. It's good that that was something they could do, she ventured.
Thomas nodded curtly. So I'd have liked to stay there, but I couldn't. They were pushing things to keep me there until they knew I wouldn't come to any harm being put on a train and ignored for a few days.
Anna had heard a bit from Lady Sybil about the state some of the patients were in when they arrived at the village hospital, and could understand why Thomas's friends had wanted him to be looked after by people who cared about him for as long as possible. I suppose it's very difficult looking after injured people while they're in transit.
It is, especially when there's such a large number at one time. They just keep moving them along the chain of evacuation until they get far enough from the fighting that the staff aren't so pressed. I expect quite a few got all the way here before they were properly seen to.
That's what Lady Sybil said, she agreed. Thomas tossed away the end of his cigarette and lit another.
I suppose they're quite busy there. She nodded, and he continued. They should have something for me to do then. I expect it'll help a bit when it comes to getting home service. I can't lift stretchers, is the real problem.
He transferred his cigarette to his right hand and held his left out a few inches to the side.
That's about as far up as that arm will go now. I can't salute with that hand either, he added, putting his hand behind his back. But I can manage at ease, so that's something.
Don't you salute with your right hand anyway?
Anna tried to remember how she'd seen it done. Depends where the officer is, Thomas explained. If he's straight ahead, you use the right. If he's passing from one side or the other, or you're passing him from one side or the other, you salute with the hand further away from him.
That seems needlessly complicated,
Anna observed. Thomas gave her another one-shouldered shrug, switching his cigarette back to his left hand. Imagine you've got a whole company of men who've been marching all day in the sun. They pass by an officer and they all raise their arms at the same time. He demonstrated, and Anna saw the problem.
Oh,
he nodded. Could be deadly. Doesn't come up very often in a hospital, though. You only salute them if they've got a hat on. Anna supposed it would be fairly silly to salute officers lying in hospital beds. You'd be doing it all day, for one thing.
I imagine there's quite a bit you'll be able to manage in the hospital.
Oh, sure. He rotated his wrist and elbow. It's fine from the elbow down. I have to be careful lifting things as it's still a bit weak, but that'll improve.
Did that mean the rest of it wouldn't? She decided to ask, and Thomas explained about nerve damage, torn ligaments, and some joint with a long name, which was apparently where the collarbone met the shoulder blade.
I'm not sure I realized that it did,
she admitted. Wasn't one on the back and the other on the front? I didn't either until I had trouble with mine, Thomas said. There's a bit of the shoulder blade that sticks out and the collarbone curves back to meet it. He pointed to his own left shoulder, presumably to where it was. It turns out the shoulder's one of the more complicated joints in the body. There's 3 different moving parts. Where the humerus, that's the upper arm, fits into the socket, the acromioclavicular, and then the shoulder blade's meant to sort of glide across your ribs in several different directions. I've got trouble with the second too.
It did indeed sound complicated, and Thomas sounded very knowledgeable about it all.
He was showing off, of course, but she found that she'd missed that about him. You're on medical leave from the RAMC, Major Clarkson said slowly. But you'd like to work here while you're on it? Yes, sir, Thomas said. Honestly, he wasn't sure why this concept was so confusing to everyone. He'd worked in both of the hospitals where he'd been as a patient. You have volunteers, don't you? The London hospital had, mostly well-off women who came in and read to patients, avoiding contact with anything which looked or smelled unpleasant. But still, I'd like to volunteer. You understand I can't pay you. Funding from our military operations comes from the War Office, and as the Army has you on leave, my hands are tied. Yes, sir. He hadn't said anything about wanting to be paid, had he? They've been kind enough to let me stay up at the Abbey, so I've no major expenses to worry about. And you mustn't expect any special treatment when it comes time for your medical panel. I may very well be on it, but I must make my recommendation upon the relevant medical facts of the case.
Damn.
Yes, sir. He hesitated. Although I had hoped that if I had a chance to show how much of the work I can manage with my arm being the way it is, That might be a relevant fact, sir." "I see," said Major Clarkson, giving him an assessing sort of look. Slightly encouraged, Thomas went on, "I can't lift stretchers, and I know that's a bit of an inconvenience to work around, sir, but I am fully trained in ward duties, and I've had a fair bit of experience with the clerical side of things, record-keeping and so on." "Very well," Major Clarkson said with a nod. "It's a bit irregular, but quite a bit about our staffing is irregular. Sister Crawley, Miss Crawley, is acting as ward sister. If you're ready to start immediately, you can report to her. We've a convoy of new patients coming in this afternoon, so I'm sure she'll have something for you to do." So Thomas went back out into the maid ward and reported to Miss Sister Crawley, who received him with less skepticism than anyone so far. "Yes, Cousin Carter mentioned you'd be convalescing up at the big house," she said. "I think it's a very good idea for you to keep busy. It can be very draining having nothing expected of you." "Yes, sister," Thomas said. "The specialists said that at this point work's the best thing for it. I got in the habit of doing everything with my right hand while it was healing, so now I've got to build up strength and figure out how to get the most use out of it. Just by the by, the other RAMC men call me ma'am rather than sister, as my status here isn't quite official." That must be what Major Clarkson had meant about other aspects of the staffing being irregular. "Let me see the range of motion." So he showed her what he had shown Anna, with the addition of demonstrating that if he used his other hand to do it, he could pull his arm a bit further forward than it would go on its own. "The passive range of motion is a bit greater than the active because of the nerve damage," he explained. "That might improve a bit, and I'll be able to lift more weight with it once I've built it back up." "Let's see how you manage with bed making," she decided. "It's a nice two-handed job, but not too taxing." She pointed Thomas in the direction of the linen cupboard, and he got to work. The other Nurse Crawley was engaged with stripping the vacant beds, and frequently stopped to exchange a few words with nearby patients while she was doing it, so in time Thomas got up to her. "You're very quick at that," she observed with a smile. "I can do it quickly or neatly, but not both at the same time." "I've had a great deal of practice," Thomas said. Was he supposed to say, "my lady"? Now, probably not. He did not, as Carson had so kindly emphasized, work for the Crawley family anymore. She appeared to take no offense. "And I'm still a beginner." They got busier once the convoy arrived. It was quite small compared to the convoys Thomas had gotten used to at the base hospital, only 4 ambulances carrying about a dozen cases. But the staff was correspondingly smaller as well. At first, Thomas went outside with the others to meet the ambulances, but after explaining 2 or 3 times that he wasn't able to lift stretchers, he decided that his presence there was doing more harm than good, and went back inside to get started on getting the patients settled. Once everyone was in a bed and had been checked on by Major Clarkson or Sister Crawley, they started on bed baths and changes of clothing. No screens were used, and the 2 nurses Crawley took part, working together on the same patient. It had been the same at the base hospital, of course, and Nurse Fortescue was quite likely the junior Nurse Crawley's social equal, but Thomas was still a bit shocked. This was, after all, Lady Sybil, not only in a room with naked men, but actually touching and looking at them. While the work was going on, she showed no sign that there was anything at all unusual in it, but a bit later met Thomas by the tea urn. Not entirely by chance, Thomas suspected. "I haven't," she said, filling a teacup, "gone into detail about the work here with everyone up at the house." Thomas nodded, taking a sip of his tea. It might have felt daring to do that earlier in the morning, but not after all the nudity. "It isn't a secret, but it seems better for everyone not to draw attention to the aspects they might find surprising." "I understand," Thomas said. "I thought you would," Nurse Crawley said with a smile. "I want to be taken seriously, and it'll be that much more difficult if Papa or someone makes a fuss." So, it wasn't a secret, but she didn't want Lord Grantham knowing about it. Thomas considered whether there was any way this could reflect badly on him if it came out. "I should think," he said carefully, aware that he was rehearsing a potential defense, "that it would be for Sister Crawley to say there was anything unsuitable being asked of you, as she's acting ward sister and a member of the family." "Yes," said Nurse Crawley, "that's precisely how I see it, and she's very sensible about these sorts of things." "I get that impression," Thomas said. "While we're on the subject," he added, "is it Nurse Crawley while we're on duty, or Lady Sybil?"
Nurse Crawley, please, she said. It's a bit confusing as there are two of us, but I don't want to put on airs. And you?
Oh, Corporal Barrow, if you don't mind.
Under the circumstances, Thomas would sound awfully familiar. And he was starting to feel like Corporal Barrow again.